Welcome to AP Daily. This is Mr. Burris from Union High School in Vancouver, Washington. Today's topic is 8.1 Responses to the Environment. So, what will we be learning today? In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at why do organisms respond to changes in their environment? How do organisms exchange information with one another? How can an organism's signaling behavior produce changes in behavior of other organisms and affect reproductive success? What types of signals do animals use to indicate dominance, find food, establish territory, and ensure reproductive success? What types of behavior does natural selection favor? And finally, how does cooperative behavior impact individual fitness and survival of a population? So let's dive in. Organisms respond to changes in their environment through behavior and physiological mechanisms. A stimulus is an external or internal signal or combination of signals that causes a response from an organism. An organism's behavioral response can affect their overall fitness. Organisms exchange information with one another in response to internal and external signals. Communication between organisms can change behavior. This type of communication is referred to as signaling behavior. Signaling behavior produces changes in behaviors of other organisms and can result in differential reproductive success. Animals use various communication mechanisms: visual, audible, tactile, electrical, chemical signals. Communication mechanisms have multiple uses. They can indicate dominance for finding food, to establish territory, and or to ensure reproductive success. Response and communication impact natural selection and evolution. Natural selection in favors innate and learned behaviors that increase survival and reproductive success. Innate behaviors are genetically controlled and can occur without prior experience or training. Learned behaviors are developed as a result of experience. Cooperative behaviors involve teamwork between organisms of the same species. This increases the fitness of the individual and increases the survival of the population. So let's look at an example. This is an example to illustrate the concept of organisms exchanging information with one another. Some species have evolved warning traits. They're used to discourage predation. It's called aposematism. Can be markings, behaviors, and or chemicals. Examples. 1. Coral snakes have a distinct red, yellow, and black banding that indicates the presence of venom to potential predators. Skunks arch their backs, raise their tails, turn their back, and stomp their feet before spraying. Let's look at another example. This is an example to illustrate the concept of communication that occurs through various mechanisms. Mammals use scent markings to establish and identify territory. They use urine, feces, or secretions from scent glands. They can contain pheromones. They can communicate social status and ownership. They can warn off competitors, or they can be used to attract females. Let's look at another example. For this example, this is an example to illustrate the concept of how natural selection favors behaviors that increase survival of populations. Honeybees are social insects that live in organized colonies. They build and maintain hives. This provides homes for both individuals and the colony. They regulate the hive temperature. Heater bees position themselves near developing bee larvae to keep them warm during cold months. They reproduce and raise their young. The queen bee will change egg-laying behaviors based on the amount of pollen collected. Worker bees collect pollen to feed larvae and the queen. Bees also perform a special dance. It is used to tell other foragers where to find good sources of nectar and pollen. So let's practice. For today's skill practice, we're going to look at questions and methods. You're going to identify experimental procedures that are aligned to the question, including identifying dependent and independent variables. For this question, I would like you to pause your video, read the question, analyze figure 1, and identify one independent variable and one dependent variable. Push play when you've done that. Welcome back. Based on the information on figure 1, you were supposed to identify one independent variable and one dependent variable. You should have came up for independent variable, a song or model, or a combination of song and model treatment groups. For the dependent variable, you should have came up with the aggression score or behavioral response. So what should you take away from today's lesson? First, organisms respond to changes in their environment to maintain homeostasis, which increases survivability. 2, organisms exchange information about changes in the environment with one another by using various communication mechanisms. 3, organisms have a variety of signaling behaviors that can help increase the survival chance of other members in the population, resulting in differential reproductive success. 4, animals use visual, audible, tactile, electrical, chemical signals to indicate dominance, find food, establish territory, and ensure reproductive success. 5, natural selection favors innate and learned behaviors that increase survival and reproductive fitness. And finally, cooperative behavior tends to increase the fitness of the individual and the survival of the population. Well, I hope this lesson has been helpful. Until next time, thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, AP Bio. This is Mr. Mansour coming to you from Tiffin Columbian High School, and this is topic 8.2, energy flow through ecosystems. In this daily video 1, you will learn, or we will learn, in this lesson, we'll describe the strategies organisms use to acquire and use energy. So what are we going to learn? Always important to see what we're going to learn here. So the first thing, how do organisms use energy to regulate body temperature and metabolism? What reproductive strategies do organisms use in response to energy availability? So it's one thing to use that energy, but then what are some strategies that they use reproductively? And so organisms use different strategies to regulate body temperature and metabolism. So endotherms, which you may have learned as being warm-blooded, but endotherms is the term that will be used. They use thermal energy generated by metabolism to maintain homeostatic body temperature. So hopefully you remember what homeostasis is, trying to keep the body in a biological balance. Examples of endothermic techniques include change in heart rate, fat storage, muscle contractions when you shiver. So these are all ways that endotherms are able to regulate their body temperature. Ectotherms, which you may have learned as being cold-blooded, but at times some animals that are out in the desert may actually have a higher body temperature than you, so cold-blooded is not the best term. Ectotherms is the term that we're going to use. Ectotherms, they lack efficient internal mechanisms to regulate and maintain body temperature. So a lot of times ectotherms will rely on behavior to regulate temperature. A behavior could be, for example, moving in and out of the sun or the shade. Maybe you have some pets at home that are ectotherms and you have a heat lamp or a heat rock for them. But the idea is that endotherms, they're using energy differently than ectotherms to maintain their body temperature and essentially metabolism. So of course we got to look at examples. So on the left we got some iguanas, which would be ectotherms, and if you notice they're on that black rock. So that rock's probably absorbing that heat during the day. You notice their skin coloration. A lot of them are darker, have a lot darker coloration. And so that would also help with regulation of metabolism and being ectotherms. Endotherms, like my friend here, the elephant, they regulate body temperature internally. And so if you notice, they have these really large ears. And so those ears on those elephants are used to help regulate body temperature. They help cool them down. They have lots of blood vessels in them. And so there's a difference between ectotherms and endotherms and how they use energy. But due to evolution, different organisms have different adaptations to survive in different environments. But these just be 2 examples. Organisms also use different strategies to regulate body temperature and metabolism. And so when we talk about this, there's a relationship between metabolic rate per unit of body mass and the size of the multicellular organism. So the size of the organism will determine their metabolic rate often. And so metabolic rate is the amount of energy expended by an animal over a specific amount of time, and a net gain in energy. If you're gaining energy, right, that can result in storage, growth, or increased reproductive output. So if you're gaining energy, right, that's a positive because that's going to allow the energy for growth to occur. That's going to allow the growth or energy to be used towards reproduction. Whereas a net loss of energy, it can relate in a loss of mass, decrease in reproduction, even possible death. So again, there's not enough energy available, right? You're losing energy. The organism may lose mass, may not reproduce, and even possible death. And so generally what we find out in nature is that the smaller the organism is, the higher the metabolic rate. Say that 3 times fast. Anyways, so let's move on. So organisms use different reproductive strategies, again, in response to energy availability. Again, the idea here is that by having these diverse reproductive strategies based on energy, they can reproduce at different times of the year. They can invest in offspring to maximize reproductive success, right? And so the idea is maximize, survive, and reproduce when we think about fitness. When energy resources are limited, animals may prioritize their own survival over reproduction, right? So they may reduce or halt their reproductive activity. If they can't take care of themselves, they're not going to be able to take care of their offspring. And so again, if resources are limited, there's going to be an issue. When they're abundant, animals may allocate more energy to reproduction, increasing reproductive output. So again, lots of energy in, prioritize survival, prioritize reproduction. Limited energy in, may not have as much reproduction. So let's look at an example. So we got polar bears, right? So think of this as your cell phone. You got a full charge on your cell phone, right? That polar bear has got full charge, lots of energy, going to produce offspring, maximize their reproductive success, has 2 offspring. Let's say there's a loss of energy in the system. For whatever reason, that polar bear is not getting as much energy, the battery's on low, probably not going to have as many offspring. So kind of keeping that idea of how much energy is going to come in, how much energy is available to that organism will determine their reproductive success. Also, in other organisms such as insects, moths, butterflies, they enter reproductive diapause, which occurs during unfavorable seasons. So winter, it's drought, these conditions are harsh. Again, they're not going to waste the energy. They can't afford to waste the energy reproducing when they got to take care of themselves. So no energy available, right? Because of diapause, not going to lay eggs. They don't have eggs. They're not going to create that larva. Larva is not going to become a pupa. Pupa is not going to become that adult butterfly. And so again, this is a way for those organisms to conserve energy. So what should we take away from all this? 1, organisms use different strategies to regulate body temperature metabolism, right? Think about the elephant in those ears. 2, endotherms use thermal energy generated by metabolism to maintain homeostatic body temperature, where ectotherms rely on behavior to regulate temperature. Endo, inside, ecto, outside. There is a relationship between metabolic rate per unit body mass and the size of the multicellular organisms. Again, smaller organisms tend to have higher metabolic rates. And last, organisms employ diverse reproductive strategies to maximize reproductive success. At times, if there's not enough energy, they're not going to reproduce. So again, I want to thank you for spending these few minutes with me going over 8.2. Again, hopefully you'll stick around for the next section of 8.2. Mr. Mansour signing off from Tiffin-Columbian High School. Have a great day. Good morning, good afternoon, AP Bio. This is Mr. Mansour coming to you from Tiffin-Columbian High School. This is topic 8.2, energy flow through ecosystem. This is daily video 2. This lesson will explain how energy flows and matter cycles through trophic levels. So what are we going to learn? I ask this every time. What are we going to learn? So what you're going to learn is what are the different ecological levels of organization from simple to complex? What's the difference between how energy flows and nutrients cycle through an ecosystem? And what are the 4 primary biogeochemical cycles that act as abiotic and biotic reservoirs in an ecosystem? So the different ecological levels of organization from simple to complex are population, community, ecosystem, and biome. And so a population is a group of the same species as you're going to see. So this would be like all of the wolves living in a particular area of a national park. A community is all the different populations that live in the same area and they interact with each other. So you might have wolves, you might have moose, you might have grizzly. That makes a community. The ecosystem is the community of organisms in the area with the abiotic or non-living factors that they interact with, such as air, water, soil. And these abiotic factors can have an impact on the ecosystem if there's not enough of them. And then finally, the biome, that's a large geographic area, has similar climate, similar vegetation. You may have learned about these in previous courses. You've got deserts, forests, and grasslands. So let's look at an example of one. So here's a watering hole somewhere in Africa. And so if we check out these arrows, those are definitely populations. So we got 2 different populations. We got zebras and a different type of ungulate. We have another group over here. And as you all see, they're all kind of hanging out this water hole playing nice. Then we group them together. That's the community, right? And so the community is all those different populations interacting with each other. If we throw in the abiotic factors, water, and soil, right, that's going to make up the ecosystem. So just looking at this, we've got our population, we got our community, we've got the abiotic, we got the biotic, and then all together that could make up a biome. So we have to see is how all of these things interact and have an impact on each other. In ecosystems, energy flows from producers to consumers is ultimately lost as heat, while nutrients cycle within the system, being reused and transformed through various processes. And so the key here is the energy flows. So energy flows. Energy enters ecosystems primarily from the sun, captured by producers like plants through photosynthesis. And so there's our sun, right? And photosynthesis, you learned about this probably in Unit 3. This energy then flows through food chains and webs as organisms consume each other. So as they're eating each other, this energy is making its way up through the food web. So again, there's that idea of a flow. At each trophic level, energy is lost as heat, making the flow unidirectional and not cyclical. And so it's not flowing in one single direction, but unidirectional, because that heat is being given off, lost at each of these levels. Whereas in nutrients, they cycle. There's a difference. So cycling, right, there's a start, it's like a circle. So in nutrient cycling, nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, these are essential elements that organisms need for growth and survival. And these nutrients are taken up by organisms. If you go back to the previous slide, those animals that they're eating, they're drinking the water, they may be eating some grass. They're taking up these nutrients that are stored in there, and then they're returned to the environment through processes like decomposition. So again, they're taken up, they're returned, and then they're going to be they're returned through decomposition and respiration. Unlike energy, this is key, nutrients can cycle between organisms in the environment. So let's talk about these cycles. So the 4 primary biogeochemical cycles are water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. And so now that we're at Unit 8, you may want to go back and think about back to Unit 1 and some of the other units. Where did carbon come up? Okay, Unit 3, nitrogen, right? Phosphorus. So these compounds, the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, play an important role in things like macromolecules. So let's look at some examples. So let's look at the water cycle or hydrologic cycle. This cycle describes the movement of water on, above, or below the Earth's surface, including processes like condensation, transpiration, precipitation, and evaporation. So here's a picture. Again, we're focusing on the water cycle. Condensation, right? That moisture is condensing up in clouds in the atmosphere. We got transpiration, where that is where moisture or water is given off by plants. Sometimes with transpiration can be impacted by humidity, if there's not enough moisture. So transpiration is one of these things, the way that plants interact with the environment. Precipitation, that is as rain, snow, whatever falls down back to earth. And again, evaporation, as we can see from the land, water being lost from the land, and also evaporation, water being lost from the ocean. So these are all ways that the water cycle kind of interacts with each other. And all of these can have an impact. You have too much precipitation and not enough evaporation or enough transpiration can have an impact on the cycle. Carbon cycle. This cycle describes the movement of carbon through the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, land, and organisms, involving processes like photosynthesis, cellular respiration, decomposition, and combustion. You've already talked about photosynthesis and cell respiration back in Unit 3, and so this should be, some of this should sound like a review. So there's our carbon cycle, carbon dioxide, and so I'm going to point out some things. So we've got CO2 is absorbed, right, by these plants. Those animals are releasing CO2. There's your cell respiration, right, and so there's that part of the cycle. You can also have CO2 being released due to combustion. Regardless, it's a cycle. CO2 is being absorbed, going into the system, or this system in case this plant. These animals are eating these plants and they're releasing that CO2 back in the environment. And again, we cannot forget sunlight for photosynthesis, because really this is one of the driving forces for the carbon cycle. By having plants do photosynthesis, they're able to take that CO2, incorporate it, and ultimately into glucose, which can be used in cell respiration. Nitrogen cycle. This cycle describes the transformation and movement of nitrogen through various forms and reservoirs involving nitrogen fixation, nitrification, and denitrification. So if we look at N2 as it's present in the atmosphere, it'll be fixed into a usable form by these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, so they can take this nitrogen gas, they convert it into a usable form. During nitrification, nitrifying bacteria, again, take nitrogen that's available, and the whole process of this is converting into usable forms for plants. And then denitrification, right? Once this nitrogen that's been converted into one form, these denitrifying bacteria take this form of nitrogen that's in the soil, that's used by plants, and returns it back to that nitrogen, that N2 up top. So as again, you see this process, you're not necessarily have to memorize this cycle, but you need to be familiar with that nitrogen cycles through the environment. And then you can probably think of ways, how could we disrupt the nitrogen cycle, right? Or how do we add to the nitrogen cycle? You know, if any of you are involved in agriculture, you have to add fertilizer. Often there's nitrogen in there. And so, again, important understanding how these cycles work and just seeing that's a process. The last one is phosphorus cycle. This cycle describes the movement of phosphorus through the Earth's crust, oceans, and organisms, involving processes like weathering, absorption, and decomposition. The one thing about the phosphorus cycle, there's not an atmospheric component because most of it's found in the soil. So again, we talk about the phosphorus cycle. You've got weathering rock, it breaks down, phosphate, right? Phosphorus will run into solution into the water. You have some absorption by plants from the soil. You have decomposition by decomposers, adding that phosphorus back into the system. But again, you're seeing this as a cycle. And so whereas where energy flows, we're not losing any of this material. So again, going back through carbon, water, nitrogen, and these phosphorus cycles. So what should we take away? The key takeaway, one, the different ecological levels of organization from simple to complex are population, community, which is all the different populations, ecosystem, think about that abiotic factors, biome, and the biosphere. Two, in ecosystems, energy flows while nutrient cycle. So again, energy flows, right? So you're losing energy flows because you're losing that heat at these different levels. While these nutrients cycle, right, they stay within the system. Three, the hydrologic cycle describes the movement of water on, above, and below the Earth's surface. The carbon cycle describes the movement of carbon through the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, land, organisms, again, focusing on photosynthesis and respiration. The nitrogen cycle describes the transformation and movement of nitrogen through various forms of reservoirs. That nitrogen has a lot more steps. It has to be converted, and so that transformation is a little more complex. And six, the phosphorus cycle describes the movement of phosphorus through the Earth's crust, oceans, and organisms. And hopefully as you're looking at those cycles, you can think about, all right, so carbon, it's found in what macromolecule, right? The nitrogen is found in what macromolecules? Phosphorus is found in what macromolecules that you've learned about in previous units. So again, I just want to thank you. Hopefully you found these videos useful. This is Mr. Mansour signing off from room 102 at Tiffin-Columbia High School. I'll see you in a later video, and have a great day. Good morning, good afternoon, AP Bio. This is Mr. Mansour coming to you from Tiffin-Columbia High School. This is topic 8.2, energy flow through ecosystems, and this is daily video 3. This lesson will explain how changes in energy availability affect populations, communities, and ecosystems. So what are we going to learn? Every time I always get asked this, what do we got to learn? What's the point of this? So what we're going to learn in this AP Daily is how do changes in energy availability affect population size, and how do changes in energy availability result in disruptions. Disruption is a key theme that runs throughout the course, and so we're going to kind of focus on how disruptions can impact energy availability. So changes in energy availability directly impact population size, with increased energy leading to larger populations and decreased energy leading to smaller populations. So if you have more increased energy availability, when resources are abundant, populations tend to grow. Those animals have energy, they're going to reproduce, and so they'll have the energy to support growth, reproduction, and survival. So they're abundant, and that's key. Populations will grow. If you have decreased energy availability, not enough food, not enough energy, whatever, when energy resources become scarce, populations decline, they drop. This can lead to reduced birth rates, increased death rates, and potentially a decrease in overall population size. So good times, there's lots of energy, right? Population goes up, not enough energy, populations go down, and so that's that decline. So changes in energy availability result in disruption. So a disruption is where you have a system, right? You've got to think in biology, we talk about systems. If you disrupt the system, you remove one of the parts, it no longer functions properly. Trophic level effects. Changes in energy availability at the top of the food web can cascade down, affecting populations at trophic levels, a trophic cascade. And so if you have enough food at the top, good. Those organisms that are at the lower trophic levels may do well. But if energy is not available, right, it can impact all those trophic levels. And so it's a cascading effect. So let's look at an example. So we've got a bear here feeding on some fish. Times are good, but something happens. So there's our bear. Something happens, and our fish population declines. There's no fish for the bear to eat. There's less energy. There's less energy for the bear. Their population may also decline. If it becomes so dramatic that there's not enough energy to sustain the population, your bears will die. And so this is just giving you an example of there's your predator-prey dynamic, the fish being the prey, the bear being the predator. They are closely interwoven together in this system. Another one, this is a good example of a trophic cascade. We've got some otters, they eat urchins. Urchins eat kelp. So kelp are like the rainforest of the ocean. So what'll happen is the otters eat the urchins, they keep the urchins in check, so then the kelp can grow. So let's say something happens, right? So when the otter population's high, urchin population's low, kelp population's high. Let's say something happens to these otters. If their population declines, there's going to be no otters to eat the urchins. The urchin population is going to go up. If you've got more urchin, right, there's more urchins available, they're going to eat more kelp, and that kelp population will decline. So this is showing you how that organism at the top, that otter, was able to impact that lower level. That's a trophic cascade. So what should we take away? Key takeaway: changes in energy availability directly impact population size. If you have lots of energy, population will flourish, it'll grow. Less energy, population will decrease. Changes in energy availability result in disruption. So example, the energy availability, we remove the otter, too many urchin, right? They remove the kelp, that's a disruption. For whatever reason, when I talk about the bear, not enough fish, that's a disruption. And so again, I want to thank you for watching this video for 8.2. And again, this is Mr. Mansour signing off from room 102 at Tiffin, Ohio, at Tiffin Columbian High School. Have a good day, and I'll see you in a later AP Daily. Good afternoon, good morning, AP Bio. This is Mr. Mansour coming to you from Tiffin Columbian High School, and this is topic 8.2, energy flow through ecosystem, and this is daily video 4. In this lesson, we'll explain how the activities of autotrophs and heterotrophs enable the flow of energy within an ecosystem. So what are we going to learn? You probably hear that from me every time I do one of these videos, but it's important that we focus on that. So what will we learn? One, what is the difference between how autotrophs and heterotrophs move energy through an ecosystem? So that's the main point of this video. So autotrophs capture energy from physical and chemical sources through processes like photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, which converts inorganic substances into organic compounds. So photosynthetic organisms like plants and algae, they use sunlight from the sun to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose through photosynthesis, which contributes to primary productivity. You've talked about photosynthesis back in Unit 3, but again, think about those photosynthetic organisms. They're using that sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water to glucose. Chemosynthetic organisms like certain bacteria, they obtain energy from chemical reactions involving inorganic molecules, which in the absence of oxygen. So deep sea vents, those kind of places where oxygen is not available. And so when we talk about chemosynthetic organisms, think about chemical reactions. They oxidize inorganic compounds like sulfur or ammonia to obtain energy. So examples of organisms that get their energy chemosynthetically are bacteria found in deep sea vents, and they often use sulfur compounds as an energy source. So here's an example of a deep sea vent. There's the chimney, there's the plume, that stuff looks like gas coming out. That often contains the nutrients that those chemosynthetic organisms are going to use for an energy source. I like to show you an example of a deep sea thermal vent just because you may have never seen one before. So there's different types, they have different temperatures, but again, different process of obtaining energy. So heterotrophs obtain energy by consuming organic matter, breaking down the organic molecules through cell respiration to release energy, and using that energy to power their cell processes. So different types of heterotrophs, you got carnivores, which consume other animals being the case. Herbivores consume plants. Omnivores consume both plants and animals. Decomposers, which are very important in cycling of nutrients, they break down dead organisms and they release those nutrients back into the environment. And again, the key there being release, and then of course scavengers, where they consume dead organic matter. So all of these heterotrophs are involved in that movement of materials and matter through the environment. So again, going back to scavengers, that material is dead. So I got a picture here. We've got a bunch of herbivores. So we got elephants, we got giraffes, we've got some other animals there. But if you notice, lots and lots of herbivores. What are we missing? Our carnivore. And it tends to be, if we remember back from food chains and food webs, right, you are going to have more herbivores present than necessarily your carnivore, because more herbivores to sustain those carnivores, because as that energy moves up through the food chain and food web, energy's lost its heat. And so that's why you tend to have more herbivores than carnivores. So I couldn't find a picture with any carnivores in there because they're probably all off to the edge waiting to hunt. So anyways, give you an idea there. So what should we take away? Key takeaways. One, autotrophs capture energy from physical and chemical sources, so photosynthesis, chemosynthesis. And two, heterotrophs obtain energy by consuming organic matter, as I showed in that previous picture. Again, thank you for spending this time today with me as you watch this AP Daily video looking at how energy moves through an ecosystem. I'm Mr. Mansour from Tiffin-Columbia High School. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of these AP Dailies.
Welcome to AP Daily. This is Mr. Burris from Union High School in Vancouver, Washington. Today's topic is 8.3, population ecology. So, what will we be learning today? In today's lesson, we'll look at what is a population, what factors influence population growth dynamics, and finally, what leads to the exponential growth of a population. Let's dive in. A population is comprised of organisms of the same species in a particular area. Individuals interact with one another and with the environment in complex ways. Individuals within a population usually interbreed with one another more than interbreeding with individuals from other populations. Many adaptations are related to obtaining and using energy in a particular environment. The size of populations largely depends upon availability of resources. When food is less available, the population size decreases. Less food energy is available to support individuals. Reproduction rates decrease, and offspring survivability decreases. However, when food is readily available, the population size increases, reproduction rates increase, more food for offspring, and survival rates increase. Different species have adaptations that aid in survival when energy availability changes. For example, storage of fat during winter months, losing leaves or growing leaves when day length changes, or migrating in response to changes in food availability. Several factors can affect population growth: age at reproductive maturity, number of offspring produced, frequency of reproduction, or survivorship of offspring to reproductive maturity. The population growth equation includes dn, which stands for change in population size, dt, which is change in time, b, which is birth rate, and then d, which is death rate. Reproduction without constraints results in the exponential growth of a population. Exponential growth refers to a sharp increase in the growth of a population. This occurs under ideal conditions when resources are abundant. The number of organisms added in each generation increases as the population gets larger. More individuals are reproducing. How long it takes to produce an offspring stays the same. Exponential growth is represented as a J-shaped curve, as you can see on the screen. The exponential growth, it is represented by the equation located on the screen, where dn is change in population size, dt change in time, n is population size, and finally Rmax is the maximum per capita growth rate of a population. So let's look at an example. For this example, I would like you to pause the video and solve what is the exponential growth rate of the population of mice for 1 month. Push play when you have your answer. Welcome back. You should have came up with a Rmax of 0.17 for the exponential growth rate. Now let's practice. For today's skill practice, you'll be looking at representing and describing data. You're going to construct a graph, plot, or chart. So for this question, I would like you to pause your video. You're going to read the question, look at table 1 and 2, and then you're going to use the template on the screen to construct an appropriately labeled line graph. When you have done that, push play, and we'll go over your answer. Welcome back. For this question, you were looking to use the template to construct an appropriately labeled line graph to illustrate the growth of species A in treatment group 1 and species B in treatment group 2. Your answer should include the correctly plotted lines for the remaining 2 treatments, so species A, group 1, and species B, group 2, which are indicated in the purple lines, correctly labeled the axes, and correctly labeled the data lines. So what should you take away from today's lesson? First, populations comprise individual organisms of the same species that interact with one another and with the environment in complex ways. Population growth dynamics depend on several factors, including time, birth rate, death rate, and population size. And then finally, reproduction without constraints results in the exponential growth of a population. I hope this lesson has been helpful. Until next time, thank you. Welcome to AP Daily. This is Mr. Burris from Union High School in Vancouver, Washington. Today's topic is 8.4, effective density of populations. So what will we be learning today? Well, in today's lesson, we'll look at what would cause a population to produce a density of individuals that exceeds the system's resource availability. And finally, we'll look at what causes a population to display a logistic growth model. So let's dive in. Resource availability in an environment impacts population density. Population density refers to how close individuals within a population live near one another. When an abundance of food is available, the population can become dense. There's a higher reproductive rate and space is limited. When food is limited, the density of a population may decrease. There's a lower reproductive rate and individuals can spread out in the limited space. Limits to population growth are due to density dependent and density independent factors. Density dependent factors are abiotic or biotic factors whose effect on population size relies on a population's density. Competition for resources, territoriality, disease, predation are all factors. Density independent factors are abiotic or biotic factors that affect population size regardless of population density. For example, natural disasters, floods, forest fires, volcanic eruptions, as well as pollution. A population can produce a density of individuals that exceeds the system's resource availability. A logistic growth model describes population growth that initially starts slowly, immediately followed by exponential growth, and ends with a relatively stable maximum growth. It is illustrated as an S-shaped curve, as you can see on the graph. Maximum number of individuals an environment can sustain is referred to as the carrying capacity, as indicated with the dotted line on the graph. Both density dependent and density independent limiting factors can cause a population to reach carrying capacity. Under certain conditions, a population can temporarily exceed the carrying capacity, as shown on the graph, and limiting factors will always bring the population size back down. Fluctuations in the population size can naturally occur at or near carrying capacity. Population dynamics can be represented using mathematical models. Logistic growth can be mathematically represented using an equation shown on the screen, where dn is equal to change in population size, dt is change in time, n is population size, k is carrying capacity, and then finally Rmax is maximum per capita growth rate of population. So let's look at an example. For this example, I would like you to pause your video and solve for what is the logistic growth if the population increases to 225 in 1 year. When you have your answer, push play. Welcome back. You should have came up with an Rmax of 1.10, which is equal to the logistic growth of the population in 1 year. So now let's practice. For this skill practice, you'll look at statistical tests and data analysis. You're going to perform a mathematical calculations, including rates. For this question, I would like you to pause, read the question, and calculate the population size after 1 year for the bison. When you have your answer, push play again, and we'll go over it. Welcome back. For this question, you were asked to calculate the population size after 1 year. Your answer should be the population will be 3,845 after a year. So what are your takeaways for this lesson? First, a population can produce a density of individuals that exceeds the system's resource availability. And then finally, when density dependent and density independent factors are imposed, a logistic growth model generally ensues. Well, I hope this lesson has been helpful. Until next time, thank you.
Hi, I'm Margaret Evans from Woodbridge Senior High School, and I will be bringing to you today AP Daily Lesson on Topic 8.5, Community Ecology. Are you ready? Well, let's get ready to science. What will we learn? Well, in this lesson, we have a few questions we'll be answering as we move through the lesson. And the first one is, how is the structure of a community measured? The second question is, what determines whether communities change over time? How do populations access energy and matter in the community? How are relationships between populations characterized? What types of interactions drive population dynamics? And lastly, how is community structure related to energy availability in the environment? As we begin this lesson, it's important for us to understand that the structure of a community is described according to species composition and diversity. So, what does that actually mean? Well, first, it's important for us to define what we mean by a community. And a community refers to a group of different species living together in the same location, and they interact with one another. Communities are described based on their species diversity and their species composition. So let's define those two terms. Diversity refers to the variety, the different types of species, and the quantity of individuals included in each species. For example, this ocean community might have one species of shark and one species of sea turtle, yet there may be 15 sharks and 62 sea turtles. Species composition refers to the identity of each species in the community. So again, for our ocean community, we might have two species of angelfish, one called Pomacanthus paru and one called Pomacanthus xanthometopin. The structure of a community is measured in terms of this species composition and diversity. And we use something called the Simpson's Diversity Index to measure species composition and diversity. So, what does this measurement tool actually indicate? It's used to measure the biodiversity of a habitat, how much diversity do we have within that particular area. And the higher the actual index value, we would say the more diverse the community is. Now, in a real live research or field environment, a scientist would go out and take random samples of the environment, and they would make counts and measurements according to the different species that they find within those random samples. So to the right here, we have a diagram that just shows a random sample showing three different species. And how do we take that information or those values in order to generate the index? And so if you notice that there are a total of 15 total individuals, and you would have to count up each of those individuals species, divide that by the total, and square that value. So if we look at species one, we have 3 individuals out of 15. 3 divided by 15 squared would give us a 0.04. And you would go through the same process for each of those species, and then you would get the sum. And the sum of those values would be 0.37, which is indicated by the sigma, sort of that backwards E symbol. Once you get the sum of that mathematical approach, then you would subtract that value from 1, and that would give us a diversity index value of 0.63 for this particular example. And again, the higher the value, meaning the closer that value is to 1, that would indicate the more diverse that community is. Interactions among populations determine how they access energy and matter. It is important for us to remember that organisms cannot create their own energy. They have to access it from the environment, and that includes all of the molecules and matter that are necessary to facilitate life. Communities change over time depending on these interactions, meaning depending upon how they access energy and matter. Competition is a very important interaction that can actually shift the dynamics of a community and how populations are able to access energy and matter. And this competition aspect of a community actually can result in some changes in community structure. It's important for us to understand that when we're talking about competition, we could be talking about competition within a species, meaning two bear of the same species competing for the same food source, or we could be talking about competition between species. Maybe you would have a wolf competing with another carnivore in the community for a food source. Um, Organisms compete for food and for habitats, and these interactions can be positive, negative, or neutral. Some of the positive interactions that we want you to be familiar with are mutualism, and in this particular instance, we are dealing with both species benefiting. Now, it's important for us to understand that these particular positive interactions are permanent interactions within the community. And so if we have two organisms participating in a mutualistic or two species, excuse me, participating in a mutualistic interaction, they have evolved to have this permanent relationship with one another. And so here we have a picture of a mutualistic relationship. If you look very closely, you'll see the bird is actually near the eye of that mammal there. And actually, they're picking out parasites and insects off of the animal's fur. And that benefits the bird because it's getting a food source, and it benefits the mammal as well because it's getting cleaned or it's getting the parasites taken off, which is a very helpful thing to happen. And so that will be an example of a positive or a mutualistic relationship. Also, we have what's called a commensalistic relationship, in which you have one species benefiting, but the other species is not harmed or helped. Now, as it relates to negative interactions, we have a couple that we're going to discuss here. One is a predator-prey. One species is using another for a food source. So here we have the pride of lions here eating unfortunately, a giraffe, and that would be considered to be a predator-prey relationship. We also have a negative interaction called parasitism, in which one species benefits at the harm of another. And so while parasites, the intention is not for the parasite to kill their host, they do have a negative impact. And depending upon the intensity of that impact, it can eventually possibly kill the host. Then we have neutral interactions in which there's no impact on the species involved. For instance, if you have deer and rabbits living in the same forest, they do interact with each other in the sense that they live near one another, but they're not competing for same resources. Their interactions are not positive or negative as it relates to one another. They would be considered neutral interactions. So let's look at an example. Here we have an example of a shelf fungus. They're called bracket or shelf fungi, and they are a type of tree parasite. So this would definitely be an example of a negative interaction, parasitism. These fungi produce fruiting bodies that grow on the bark of the tree. Now, why is this considered to be a negative interaction? Well, they are absorbing nutrients from the outer bark of the tree, and that's actually robbing the tree of some vital nutrients. This could eventually lead to the weakening of the external structure of the tree. Therefore, the tree may not produce as many leaves or foliage. They might have reduced canopy, which means the coverage of these leaves and foliage in the community. Um, and this potentially could cause less photosynthetic ability or less ability of the plant itself or the tree itself to make its own food. However, that does free up some resources from some other organisms, and we'll talk about that. The growing of the fungus on the tree can also, if the infection or the infestation of the parasite is extreme, it can lead to the infecting the interior parts of the tree, which will cause the branches or the entire tree to rot and possibly fall. Now, this could be beneficial to the community as a whole because it could provide new available niches and habitats for other organisms. A fallen tree leaves room for other things to grow. A fallen tree provides habitats for other organisms to live in. And so these parasites, while they may be causing a negative impact on the tree itself, they potentially are beneficial to the overall community as there are some positive results. They provide microhabitats for insects and other organisms. Insects can live in the holes that the fungi creates when they produce their fruiting bodies. Also, these fungi can provide a food source for animals that like to eat fungi. And so there winds up, if we look at the holistic interaction, this one negative interaction could potentially have some positive results for the entire community. Relationships among interacting populations can be modeled. And when we mean by modeled, we mean diagrammed, graphed, etc. So, relationships can be characterized, as we mentioned before, as positive and negative effects, and they can be modeled. And one of the most common predator prey interaction models would be the graph that you see to the right. And we'll take a look at analyzing that. If you notice in that graph, you see that the rabbit is the prey and the fox is the predator. And if you take a look at their increase and decrease in population size, you see that the fluctuations in the fox population is in response to the fluctuation in the rabbit population. So as you see an increase in the predator population, that occurs slightly after an increase in the prey population. So as we get more rabbits, that gives more food to the predators and allows them to live and reproduce and create more foxes. And you see that slight delay in increase. Clearly, because the fox are predators to the rabbit, when their population size becomes very large, you'll start to see a decrease in the rabbit population. So you'll see as the peak of the fox population occurs, you see that that corresponds to a decrease in the rabbit population. And that would be a common cycle that you would see between a predator and prey interaction. Another interaction that can be modeled is something called a trophic cascade. And this refers to the negative effect of the removal or decrease in a key species on trophic levels. And trophic levels would be your food chain levels from producers to consumers, etc. And as you remove different species within that food chain, then that affects other communities and other populations at various trophic levels. And that can be modeled as well. So populations can experience exponential growth or death with the removal of a key species population. And this could potentially interrupt the flow of energy through the ecosystem as food energy flows from the producers up the trophic levels. Another interaction that can be modeled is something called niche partitioning. And this refers to a decrease in competition over limited resources between two similar species because they're accessing the resources in different ways. So if you have two species that are using the same resources, well, that interaction, that negative competition can actually be decreased if the species are accessing those resources differently, and therefore that will minimize the competition between them. So let's practice. Our skill focus for this particular lesson is going to focus on statistical tests and data analysis using confidence intervals and or error bars to determine whether sample means are statistically different. So here's an example of an AP level question focusing on ecosystems and ecological relationships. And I'm going to give you a second to pause to analyze this particular question and then come back when you think you have the answer. All righty, well, welcome back. And your answer should be B. And if we understand how to analyze error bars as it relates to statistical difference, we should understand that any overlap in the error bars means that there is no statistical difference. So if we're looking at the statistical difference between which of the stream types had a statistically lower macroscopic invertebrate species diversity compared to the seasonal streams, if you look at the seasonal streams, you'll see the error bar here. And the only other graph bar on this graph that does not have an error bar that overlaps with the seasonal error bar would be the intermittent. And that means that these two are in fact statistically different from one another. So our selection should be B. So what should we take away? Well, there are several takeaways, and just as a summary, the structure of a community is measured by species composition and species diversity, understanding that there are constant interactions between populations within a community, and those interactions can be positive, negative, or neutral, and that we have, even in some communities, permanent relationships that can be established and shift the dynamics of the community structure. So I hope your academic interactions with our AP Daily videos continue to be positive. Biology out. Well, welcome to our AP Daily Biology videos. And I'm Margaret Evans from Woodbridge Senior High School, and I'll be bringing to you topic 8.6 on biodiversity. I hope you're ready. So let's get ready to science. So what will we learn in this lesson? First thing we will learn about is the type of ecosystems, about the types of ecosystems and which ones are less resilient due to changes in the environment. How does diversity of species within an ecosystem influence the organization of the ecosystem? What contributes to maintaining diversity of an ecosystem? And lastly, how does the addition or removal of any component of an ecosystem affect its overall short-term and long-term structure? So we're going to start off with making sure we understand that ecosystem diversity is related to its resilience to changes in the environment. Typically, the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is to changes in the environment. So you see our little Arctic environment here with our friendly polar bears. And in these types of environments in which the polar bear lives, there's not much diversity. So these particular environments are very fragile to changes. So minor changes can potentially cause a disruption in the entire structure of that ecosystem. And that would be the same for naturally occurring ecosystems like the one pictured here or artificial ecosystems. The diversity of a species within an ecosystem may influence the organization of that ecosystem. And what we mean by that is how many producers do we have? How many consumers do we have? All of that will depend on how the populations interact. Obviously, if we only have one key producer in the environment, then all of the consumers will have to access in one way, shape, or form that sole producer that's in that environment. And that will definitely be structured very differently than an environment that has lots and lots of different producers or consumers, etc. The long-term structure of an ecosystem can be stabilized with more diversity, and they are less vulnerable to drastic structural changes. So again, the more diverse an environment, the more resilient it is to changes that may occur. Changes in diversity can cause short-term or long-term structural changes. So if we do have a shift in the community, that could be a short-term shift, or it potentially could be a long-term shift, depending upon how it influences the overall structure. Abiotic and biotic factors contribute to maintaining diversity of an ecosystem. Remember that an abiotic factor would be referring to those non-living parts of the environment like wind and rain and sunlight, and the biotic factors would be all of the living organisms within the environment. The diversity of species within an ecosystem may influence the organization. Abiotic factors help maintain ecosystem diversity, meaning the more sunlight you have, the more plants can grow. The more water you have, the more animal species and plant species can be supported by the availability of water, etc. So climate, water, and nutrient availability, light availability would be some of those abiotic factors that would be instrumental in supporting ecosystem diversity. Biotic factors help maintain ecosystem diversity as well. Producers help to support other organisms further up in the trophic levels. Many populations depend on producers directly for food and habitats, and all of the other organisms depend upon the producers indirectly. Also, producers help with maintaining landscapes within ecosystems, which is important. They can help reduce erosion. And dominant predators keep prey populations under control. And these will be some of our biotic factors that influence population structure. And so if you have a dominant predator, they're keeping other populations under control. They usually have diversified diets, which means they usually don't just eat one particular food source, which means they can influence many different populations based on what they're eating. And this will help to alleviate one particular population or prey population being pressured too much by the presence of that predator. A keystone species is a little bit different in the sense of its impacts on the overall health or structure of an environment. And one of the things that's important to understand about a keystone species is that their effect or impact or importance in an environment is disproportionate relative to their abundance. And so let's first take a look at what do we mean by keystone species. We are talking about a species that the entire community structure depends depends upon. These species tend to have smaller populations compared to other populations in the community. That's what we mean by disproportionate to their relative abundance. So for instance, our wolf here, we don't find too many wolves in, wolf populations don't consist of hundreds and thousands of wolves, but their impact on the environment is very great. And so they would be considered to be a keystone species because of the way that they put pressure on certain populations. They control the certain prey populations within the environment, and they help to maintain appropriate community structure. When they are removed from the ecosystem, these keystone species, the ecosystem often collapses. And this is just reiterating that they are responsible for controlling many different aspects of population dynamics within their community. If you have an overpopulation of prey species, that will result in a depletion of resources. So the fact that these keystone species, like the example of the wolf, can actually control other populations actually makes more resources available to other organisms because they keep those prey populations under control. Let's look at an example. An African elephant is a keystone species, and most people don't know that about the African elephant. And how so do they represent a keystone species? Their tusks are used to dig up riverbeds. They create watering holes for many different animals. And if you know anything about the African savanna, you know that water is a premium. And so providing holes in the ground where water can collect is a very important aspects of that community for all sorts of different organisms that live there. Their dung, which would be their feces, their droppings, actually provide habitats for insects like the dung beetle. The dung helps to also distribute seeds, which provides opportunity for plants to disperse throughout the landscape. Their feeding habits actually influence the landscape. African elephants and elephants in general eat tons and tons of vegetation a day, and that helps to clear out trees and shrubs, providing pathways for other organisms and allowing other organisms to navigate a very difficult terrain by freeing up this space for them to travel. So let's go ahead and practice. Our skill focus will be predicting the cause or effects of a change in or disruption to one or more components in a biological system. And that's focusing on our ability to practice argumentation. So I'll give you an opportunity to read this particular example here or question here. You pause your video and then we'll come back and we'll take a look at your answer. All right, well, welcome back. As we've read through this example of ecological succession, it says predict the change in ground floor diversity if canopy trees were artificially planted immediately after the field was abandoned. And we have to use our diagram to assist with that. And so here are two possible predictions you could have made. You could have made a prediction that there would be less ground floral diversity overall, or that it would take longer for the diversity of ground flora to increase. Now, why do we say that? Because if we notice, if we give the landscape time, it takes a whole lot more time for the canopy trees to actually grow. Think about growing from a seedling to a sapling to an actual full-blown tree takes a whole lot longer than possibly some of these smaller shrubs and ground flora, which would be like mosses and things like that. So while the trees are slowly growing, that gives the ground flora an opportunity to get a leg up and begin to reproduce and establish their populations. And that's why you see on this graph, if we look at the 0 to 20, when the canopy trees are still low in number, that gives the ground flora an opportunity to have exponential growth. However, if we were to artificially plant trees, which means that, we're planting these mature canopy trees in the environment immediately after the abandonment of the field, then they will be cutting off some of the main sunlight that the ground flora would need to actually grow. And so we would predict that you would not get this sharp increase in diversity of ground flora, not as many ground plants would be able to grow with the immediate implantation or planting of mature canopy trees in the environment. So we should predict that if these trees are immediately planted, then we would not have this high degree of ground flora, or it would take a lot longer for the ground flora diversity to increase. So what should we take away? Key takeaways that the natural or artificial ecosystems with fewer component parts are less resilient to changes in the environment, which makes them more fragile. Long-term structure of an ecosystem can be stabilized with more diversity. Keystone species, producers, and other abiotic and biotic factors contribute to maintaining diversity within the ecosystem, and the effects of keystone species as it relates to the overall health and structure of the ecosystem is disproportionate to their relative abundance, but their removal has the potential to collapse an entire ecosystem. So I hope our AP Daily lessons have allowed your intellectual ecosystem to diversify. Biology out. Hi, I'm Margaret Evans from Woodbridge Senior High School, bringing to you today AP Biology, topic 8.7, Disruptions to Ecosystems. Are you ready? Well, let's get ready to science. What will we learn? Well, in this video lesson, we will learn about the environment and how the environment interacts with random or pre-existing variations in populations. How do invasive species affect ecosystem dynamics? What human activities lead to changes in ecosystem structure and/or dynamics? And lastly, how do geological and meteorological activities lead to changes in ecosystem structure and/or dynamics? It's important for us to first understand that evolution is characterized by change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. So it's important, if we're studying ecologies, we understand how evolution actually impacts changes in populations and ecosystem structure over time. It's important for us to take a look at some definitions in order to put this into context. So when we say an adaptation, students always like to say, an animal or an organism has an adaptation, but what do we actually mean by that word? We're talking about a genetic variation that is favored by selection. And what we mean by that is some sort of trait that provides an advantage to the organism in that specific environment. So if that trait does not provide an advantage, we really wouldn't call it an adaptation. It's a trait, but an adaptation has to have a selective advantage. Now, how is this related to genetic populations or population genetics over time? Well, if an adaptation provides an advantage, then we expect this adaptation to increase in the population, as that organism will have a better chance of survival. And guess what? If they reproduce, they have a chance of passing that advantageous trait on to other individuals within the population, and that eventually can change the population dynamics over time. It's important for us to understand that adaptations are not on purpose. They are mutations, and mutations are random changes in the genetic makeup of an individual that could result in different traits or the different expression of traits. It is important that we understand that these mutations can persist if there is a specific environmental condition that is favoring that mutation. It will increase in frequency in the environment as long as the trait is being selected for. And so what does the appearance of new mutations do as it relates to population dynamics? Well, eventually it can increase biodiversity. It can allow populations to evolve over time as different traits will be selected for or against. And ultimately, there is a potential through the accumulation of new mutations to drive speciation and evolution of that population. Invasive species affect ecosystem dynamics, and so we have sometimes the unintentional or sometimes intentional introduction of a species into an environment. And here we have a water hyacinth, which is actually an invasive species. The availability of resources can result in uncontrolled population growth and ecological changes that the invasive species can actually participate in or impact. So when we say an invasive species, what do we mean? mean? We mean that it's a species that is not native to that environment. And ultimately, the presence of this species can actually harm the community that it is introduced to because it shifts the availability of resources in that environment because that potential species is accessing a niche or that is allowing it to grow uncontrollably in that environment, which decreases resources for other organisms. And as I mentioned before, this can be an unintentional or an intentional introduction of an invasive species. They exploit new niches, and as a result of this, they can cause damage to the environment. And this could be a niche that's free of predators. So if you introduce a new species and this species doesn't have a natural predator, then that gives that organism the opportunity to grow exponentially and sort of rob the environment of resources that other organisms can use. In addition to that, an invasive species could outcompete other organisms, other native organisms for resources. And so clearly the native organisms would begin to decrease because they're being outcompeted. And these populations of invasive species can potentially go unchecked because they're outcompeting native species and or they do not have natural predators or competitors in their environment. Let's look at an example. I know many of you all would be pretty sad to know that domesticated cats are actually considered to be an invasive species, specifically feral cats. Domesticated cats do not occur naturally in the wild, and so feral cats, which are known as Felis catus, are unsocialized cats and are considered to be an invasive species in North America. And here's a picture of my two little darling fur babies, and if they were feral and out in the environment, they would be considered to be invasive species. Domesticated cats were first brought to the US in the 17th century. And they are attributed to the removal of billions of birds and small animals each year. The domesticated cat is considered to be the number one top predator because they do not kill out of a need for food. They often kill out of a need for fun and entertainment. And by doing so, they contribute to major reductions in bird populations. They have been suspected of causing extinction of many small animal species, and they definitely can outcompete some of their other small predator counterparts. The distribution of local and global ecosystems can change over time due to human activity. Habitat changes can occur because of the expansive reproduction of humans and accessing of resources. Human impact accelerates changes on both a local and global level. And so here we have a picture of a city. Clearly, it's a very crowded environment, and it definitely will impact the surrounding ecosystem. In the bottom picture, we see deforestation and the removal of trees from an environment can definitely impact the global ecosystem, the local ecosystem, but also the global ecosystem as trees contribute to oxygen production in the atmosphere. They help to control both local and global climate. And so the removal of trees through human activity can definitely have both a local and global impact. In addition to things like urbanization, which we would send more pollution into the environment, and that can affect both the local environment and the global environment as well. The introduction of new disease can also devastate native species, as humans have been migrating across the globe, then there is the potential to bring disease with them and introduce that into different environments that can disrupt the ecosystems over time. So human migration overpopulation has accelerated the spread of disease and has shifted community structures and global ecosystems. Let's look at an example of that. I'm sure many of you all are familiar with the Irish potato famine that occurred in the mid 1800s, the 19th century. And potato crops actually were first domesticated in South America and introduced throughout the Americas in addition to Europe through trade practices. But there was a particular fungal species that actually infected potato crops in the early 19th century, and it was a common fungal species. Scientists have now identified the strain as the HERB-1 strain, or the HERB1 strain, that was responsible for damaging those crops at that time. Central American and South American crops were greatly affected by this infestation, but not as much as European crops. And that's because in Europe, certain places like in Ireland, due to the economic status, the Irish farmers weren't able to be as selective in which crops they were able to cultivate, and they sort of inadvertently began to spread this infection not only amongst the crops that were infected, but widespread infestation occurred that resulted in the destruction of approximately 50% of all potato crops. And this led to the Great Famine that killed approximately 1 million people between 1845 and 1851. And this was a direct result of human spread of disease through trade practices and through this agricultural practice of growing potato crops. Geologic and meteorological activities lead to changes in ecosystems as well. And so these sorts of events can actually affect habitats and cause major ecosystem disruption. We can definitely understand how a huge meteor could disrupt an environment upon impact, and large volcanic eruptions can devastate habitats in the area, and they also emit a tremendous amount of chemicals into the environment that can shift atmosphere contents and other ways that organisms access key nutrients from the environment. And they can accelerate evolution by wiping out organisms and leaving the ones left behind to occupy those niches. And so these events definitely can cause dramatic impacts and changes in the environment. These are some different ways that meteorological and geological events could actually accelerate evolution through reproductive isolation and changing selective advantages as the environment shifts. Definitely other traits might be selected for or selected against. Wiping out organisms can provide new niches for new organisms to flourish or prosper. Creating a mountain through a volcanic eruption can separate populations from one another and allow them permanent separation that could lead to evolution. These events, as I mentioned before, can cause extinction, and there's ways that we can actually study how these events can actually change ecosystems. And we can analyze the distribution after an event has occurred. Where are the organisms now versus where were they before? And then we can use these shifts in the ecosystem, climate shifts, habitat shifts, to begin to use those characteristics to identify biomes. Are we now dealing with a tundra environment, a rainforest environment, microbiomes, because of these big, massive shifts that have occurred due to these events? So let's go ahead and practice. And so our skill focus is statistical tests and data analysis. And we're going to be using data to evaluate a hypothesis, and either including supporting or rejecting the alternative hypothesis, or refuting the alternative hypothesis. So I'm going to give you guys a chance to take a look at this environment, this question here, which is dealing with the population of beetles in this environment. And so pause your video and take a moment to consider your choice, and then pop back on when you think you know the answer. All right, well, welcome back. And so what answer should you have chosen? And your answer should have been C. And so this scientist has hypothesized that the introduction of this species is going to disrupt the island over time. And as we look at this graph, how does this graph either support that concept or that hypothesis, or refute it? And so we take a look at the introduction of C, which is indicated by a dotted line. You notice that eventually the population of species C begins to increase. And look at the point in which it increases. We see that another species B, is decreasing. And so the researchers hypothesis that the introduction of this species into this island would disrupt the actual island dynamics over time is actually accurate. And we can see that through that indication there. So letter C should have been the one that we selected, that the population density of species B experienced a drop in the population density of experience a drop in their population density when the density of species C began to increase. So we would support that statement based on what has been provided. We're looking for the statement that supports the researchers' hypothesis that species C will disrupt the island ecosystem. And we see that that has occurred eventually at around between 1994 and 2004. So what should we take away? The key takeaways would be an adaptation is a genetic variation that can be favored or selected for, and that can actually increase in the population and begin to change the dynamics of a population over time. The intentional or unintentional introduction of an invasive species can actually cause disruption to an ecosystem by exploiting new niches and robbing the environment of resources. The introduction of diseases can actually devastate native species, and human activity has contributed to the spread of disease. And geologic and meteorological events affect habitat change and ecosystem distribution over time. So make sure you watch all of our AP Daily videos and don't let complacency be an academic invasive species. Biology out.